Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our community feedback webinar. We're pleased to have you join us tonight. My name is Scott Harvey. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for District 303, and I'll now turn it over to our Superintendent, Dr. Paul Gordon.
Scott, thank you so much. Good evening, District 303. We're excited to have you here, and on behalf of the Board of Education, myself, welcome to our boundary webinar. Tonight, we have Robert Schwartz with us again from RSP and Associates, and he's going to walk through the different concepts that the community has already seen. Plus, he'll bring forward some modified modified concepts at the elementary, middle, and high school. Before I hand it over to Rob, I just want to make sure it's really clear to our community. As you're seeing these different concepts, know that concept 1 at elementary can go with concept 2 at middle school, or concept 2A that will be seen tonight at the high school. So it does not need to be one singular concept, straight through concept 1 would be concept 1 all the way through from elementary, middle to high school. So I really want to make sure our community keeps that in mind as you're listening to Rob and you're hearing the different perspectives about each of these concepts as we go through this. But I really am excited, and I just sincerely appreciate all of the feedback through the surveys, through emails, as we continue to hone in on the best boundaries possible for our community. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Robert Schwartz from RSP and Associates.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. I really want to start out with this one thought. Really thank the administration and the board for this additional opportunity for there to be public input. This initially was not in the process, and we'll talk about that in a moment. A little bit about stuff. If you can push my thing on there on the presentation. Thank you. Now I can click it. Great. So a little bit about RSP for those of you who are new to this process of the boundary changes. We are a firm that works with school districts all through the Midwest. And that was specifically why the district asked us to be involved in this project, to have things based on data and based on principles and criteria that would help drive some of the changes that are in place. There's lots of people on our team that are responsible for the visuals you see that will range from Jenna Wallace, a planner, to some of our GIS analysts that create some of these maps. Again, I just want to give you some certainty in the work that we're doing, that it's all related towards some objectives, but ultimately getting at what's going to be best for the students in the classroom. Some of the discussion points we're going to talk about tonight are very familiar to what you may have heard in the 2 public input meetings. We're going to set the stage of why we're here. We're going to talk a little bit about the enrollment analysis. We're going to get into the concepts that were presented at those public inputs. That's concept 1 and concept 2. We'll have a little bit of the feedback, the themes and survey results, and then we'll talk more about concept 2A. Now, what I want to say, and I hope I say it many times with 2A, this did not evolve out of people saying things, being the sticky wicket or the loudest voice. There were comments that were made at those public inputs, and when we evaluated them based on those metrics that I'm going to talk about in the setting the stage, that came about in creating what you see. And so I think that's the great thing about this process, and why I go back to thanking administration and the board to say, let's let the people have one more look at some things as we've tried to take into account some of their perspectives, whether it related to transportation, number of students in the schools, or whatnot. And then the last piece will be the concept comparison. So bear with me, this is a lot of information tonight. You will see before you what this process has meant. Started back in September 25th. You'll see there's been some admin team meetings that are the green bars. We've had public input sessions. We've had an official survey. There's another survey that we have after this. Dr. Gordon will talk more about that at the end of my discussion. But here we are on January 11th. We have this additional community meeting webinar to give you an update on where this process is, what this map could potentially look like, what the board will receive as they try to get to the point of approving a boundary officially on February 12th. We had some guiding principles, just like the public input. I'm not going to read each of these bullet points, but they are important in how you see what is happening in each of these concepts. All important, all help guide what that framework is that we're looking to guide. And I think the biggest thing that really stands out here is one of those middle bullet points, is that there could be boundary changes at all levels: elementary, middle school, and high school. We worked with administration and the Board of Education to prioritize criteria that would give us the metrics by which we can measure whether a plan is meeting certain things. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because I think it's important. The board set forth some primary boundary criteria, and then they had secondary boundary criteria. This has nothing to do with elementary versus secondary. It was how they structured the criteria as a prioritization. So there were primary boundary criteria and then these secondary criteria. What you're going to hear tonight specifically as we started to really examine what concept 1 and 2 meant from the feedback, that there are some things that are in the secondary boundary criteria we just can't avoid. And it's really that third criteria, and that's transportation considerations. We just can't send kids across the district without the knowledge that that's going to impact the amount of time to get to those facilities, the amount of time to ride a bus or ride a car. And so there are some things that, yes, there may be a lot of kids in a building, but where we send them, we're really limited as you compare that to the capacity that there may be in each of these facilities. Again, all of these criteria are looked at in each of the plans that have been presented and what I'm going to share with you with 2A. So we had some of these other objectives that are built into this plan. And one of the big elements is transitioning all of the elementary schools to K-5, meaning that Davis and Richmond would no longer be a paired school of a K2, 3, 5. We also would be taking Lincoln Elementary and repurposing that for a different use, which means it no longer will have an attendance boundary. We're also transitioning Fox Ridge to be a K-5 elementary school, and all of the elementary school students for childhood would be relocated to Haynes. And of course, Fox Ridge, being a K-5 building, will have an attendance boundary. And then we're transitioning all the dual language to Richmond. So lots of changes, along with buildings going online, being repurposed, and moving programs to better serve the students that need each of these different services. So a little bit of review on how we've gotten to where we are today with some of the enrollment analysis. Everything that we've created for our analysis goes down to the planning area level. This visual shows what a planning area looks like with the green lines, and we have the units when they were built as the dots. This helps us understand things that are happening with enrollment, demographics, development, and most assuredly, what this might mean for future enrollments as we look at changes in attendance boundaries. All of that data goes back into a sophisticated forecast model or a statistical forecast model. It's statistics that are driving this, and it's the data that we've put into the system that helps us understand how some of these subdivisions, multifamily apartments, duplexes are changing over time in the past and where they potentially could go as we look at some of the other metrics as it relates to data in your district. We'll simply state it, look at what's happening with the enrollment by grade, which is shown in this table. to understand how those students are aging over time. We'll look at out of district students and how those changes, those trends are evolving. And so on this visual, we're showing 3 of the school districts and what's happened over time with the number of students that we get that don't live within the district boundary, but are coming in. You can see it's dramatically decreased. We factor that into the enrollment projections. We've looked at live birth data. This is important. When you look at this table, we can clearly see there's fewer live births happening in Kane County. We also know that if those live births decrease, we know that it has an impact on the number of potential future kindergartners we might have 5 years later. That's where when you see the green and yellow shaded cells, that's giving kind of a potential market share of students. If we want to change the number of kindergartners that we have, a couple of things may need to happen. The first is we get a greater share of market live births, comparing that to 5 years ago. The second would be more people move into the district that are younger age families. That's a challenge when we look at nationally. We look at the state of Illinois, we have fewer live births. It gets into some of the demographics that's factored in. We look at migration trends. On this visual, the orange part of the bars represent new students to the district. So they weren't there the previous year. You can see we have 3 different school years. We've broken it out by each level of elementary, middle school, and high school. The green bars are students that the previous school year were here receiving services, but in the year that we're analyzing, they left for whatever reason. They may still live in the district. More often, they no longer live in the district. This gets at that migration, that movement of students that are naturally happening with your student data through each of the grade levels. We've looked at development over time because that influences who wants to move into your community, what that housing product is, what that value is. This visual clearly indicates what number of units we had at the start of the decade, and that would be referenced with the red portion of the bar. And then the units that were built during that decade is the aqua blue green color that you see above it. Clearly, development slowed in the decade of 2010 to 2019. That last chart or bar, that's just 3 years of data, so it's not a complete decade. But we can see why that had some sort of influence in the number of students in the future. The importance of this, we're tracking that subdivision life cycle and what we think happens with each of those planning areas. We've worked with the cities to understand what growth may mean and where that is. And we have a new development that's on the south side that's not even in our numbers, because many times when we looked at that area, developments had been proposed, it was commercial, and they were eliminated. We have new information that would indicate that plan may move forward. And so that'll be something we talk about with our plans on making sure we have space in the building for that new development that was initially anticipated at the time of our study not to happen. So in this visual, green areas represent current developments, yellow areas represent an area that potentially would happen in the next 5 years. The importance is we factor that into the forecast. And on this visual, you see what that enrollment forecast is moving toward. And I would say a stable to slight increase in enrollments when we compare this current school year and we go out to the 2028-29 school year. You can see that breakdown. The red is the elementary students, blue is the middle school, green is the high school. We also have worked with the district on the capacity of buildings. And here's another way in which we've looked at capacity that's important when the rubber hits the road of whatever a boundary change looks like. For that matter, before you even do a boundary change. So we ideally have the number of sections. So that would be if we have kindergarten students, how many kindergarten grades would be in there? And there's 3. We have the number of classrooms that are in each of those buildings, and then how that relates to what the capacity is of that building. So this gives us a sense for each of the grade levels of elementary, middle school, and high school. How many kids can we fit in there with the programming, with things that tie back to the union contract with staffing, and really just how space is working with programs. This is important because the district wanted to have equity in what that experience may be. Spaces may look different, but we wanted to make sure that classrooms were available for art, music, and Empower, as well as taking into account some of the other special uses, special programming that needs to take place in one of these buildings. So capacity is a huge part of understanding what this may mean in whatever boundaries are going to be changed. We started with our baseline of our current elementary school boundaries. You can clearly see that with our current boundaries, we already have some islands to take into account that where buildings are or where they are not, compared to where students are or where they are not, we get some sort of mix of students that may make sense with the current boundaries. RSP didn't establish this. These are the boundaries that were in play at the start of our project. This is our baseline of how we look at everything. We've shown some visuals of where students are. In this case, the red areas represent where we have the greatest clustering of students that are K through 5 with the 23-24 student data. So again, this gives you a sense of where those students reside. We've looked at the middle school attendance areas for these two boundaries. That's why we have two colors. We've looked at the high school boundaries. And then we've looked at how does this all relate to the way in which we look at capacity. So we have two different capacity numbers that are listed. So without flex space and with flex space. So there are some what I would call bubble classrooms or classrooms that could be used for other programming. The difference between without flex and with flex is without flex, we're using some of these other spaces for other program need, whereas with flex, if we use those programs different than those other program needs, this is the number of kids that potentially could be in the building. We typically try to go with the without flex spaces because that's how the building is programmed, and there's reason why those spaces need classrooms. We've looked at the current demographics as our baseline of how things may look. In this case, we're showing a couple metrics. The first is ethnicity, and then the second is as it relates to the free and reduced lunch classification, so the socioeconomics of student need. And so you get a baseline of what it is currently. Goals being that potentially could we have boundaries that keep things similar, or maybe it moves it where it's more diverse, or it moves the population that we can better allocate resources. Again, this is the current situation. We have the current feeder, and we have the breakdown below on the percentage of students that would end up being broken between going from elementary into the middle school or middle school into the high school. Do you see that comparison? And that's important as we start to look at boundary changes is, do we have the right group of kids? Is it too few of kids that are experiencing whatever that change is? Again, depending on your lens, if you're impacted, you may like one particular version better than the other. We have some current challenges. And so what was created on this map is where we have availability. The buildings are circled with the blue circle around it. Where we have the exclamation point, those are places where we have capacity challenges over the next 5 years. You can clearly see our challenges with space are mostly on the north side, and we have space opportunities in the south, generally speaking. A lot of this goes back to the visuals I've tried to present to you tonight about where kids are, where the facilities are, and how do we get kids there that may make sense in places where we just don't have facilities. So concept one, this is what we presented to the public inputs. There is no new information here. This is the same information that we had previously. If there's anything, we may have enhanced the map visuals to help illustrate some things that were presented as maybe some flaws in how to identify where you are on the map. What you see here, solid colors being what is proposed for that concept. You notice there's a key word there, draft. And you'll see it's a draft because we're evolving it to this 2A that I'll present here in a moment. The dotted line that's kind of a red, white, or red, light blue color, those represent the current boundaries. As you can see quickly on the map, the current boundaries as it relates to what's being proposed in this concept. And there's strengths and weaknesses to each of these concepts. We did the same thing for middle school and high school. And I want to touch on one important piece. Dr. Gordon is 100% right. He's probably not used to hearing 100% right, but he's 100% right in this thing. You can integrate, you can change some of these concepts around based on what you like or don't like at the secondary level. So I may like elementary concept 1 and want concept 2 middle school, concept 1 high school. That's a possibility. There's nothing that's locked in here. When we built these concepts, we built them with the idea that it might be all of concept 1, elementary, middle school, high school, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's important for you to understand. Again, here's the visual with the high school. Very little change. We heard a lot of conversation about those little changes, where I'm saying little, again, not making a judgment of it's a good or bad thing, but a little change in the sense of what the current boundary is could have a dramatic impact if you're the person that's being changed to a different boundary. How did that relate when we got into projections? Again, trying to provide that metrics to understand that is this a good thing? And so you'll see the capacity of the building listed. And then as we move forward with the changes being put into play for 24-25 school year, what does this mean as we move into 28-29? You'll see the percent utilization as well. So in concept 1, we had some challenges with overcapacity at Coron Elementary and some underutilization at Richmond. We go down to the middle school, Redling Middle School, overcapacity. Again, we're challenged at the middle school level. We're pretty tight with the number of kids. When you look at 14-12, actually let's go down to middle school, the 28-27, and when we go down to 28-29, 28-25, pretty thin slice for capacity. We get into the demographics. What we try to illustrate here with those cells is where there's been change more than 5% up or down from what that building experienced. We naturally will see some changes that occur at Davis and Richmond because of what's happening with the dual language. So it's going to be quite impactful for how we look at some of these metrics. But again, in concept 1, you can see what some of those changes are. Where it's red, it's greater than 10% from what it was. Green is where it lowered more than 10% from that district average. Same situation with their demographics of ethnicity and the socioeconomics there for the middle school, high schools. Then with concept 1, we looked at how does this relate to the feeder system. And we can see that when we look at the elementary buildings and how they feed into the middle school, that we have Wild Rose where it's broken between the 2 middle schools. And then to the right, you can see how in concept 1, the elementary boundaries completely go into the high schools. Yes, there's a change at the middle school, but they all meet up as neighborhoods that are in the elementary building at the high school. Below that, you see that same breakdown in the number of students and how that looks with those that would go to Thompson or those that would go to Redling. And of specific, it's with Wild Rose. How does that break fit together? We looked at the students impacted by this boundary change. And one note that I'm going to make that will make sense, I won't have to make this in any of the other slides. When we look at the SIBC, we're looking at the students based on where they reside today. And at the elementary level, they're K-4 students that next year will be 1st through 5th grade. 5th grade moves into middle school. We look at that differently when we get to middle school and how that change is influenced. But this gives us a metric of those current K-4 students, who's going to be impacted and what buildings are they going to be sent to. So for instance, when we look at Norton Creek and we follow that row over to Fox Ridge, we know that there's 67 current K-4 students that would be assigned to Fox Ridge that were at Norton Creek. So again, just giving you an understanding of how to look at this table. That was concept one. Concept one's idea was that the elementary buildings would completely feed into the high school, knowing it was nearly impossible to get a complete feeder based on the location of our secondary buildings and the capacity of those secondary buildings, and trying to make sure we utilize those buildings in the best efficient manner possibly. Concept two, again, looking at this from a little bit different perspective, same visuals of how you need to look at these maps and what that means with the dotted line versus the solid color. So again, some different changes. What this meant for the middle school. So quite a bit of change at the middle school between the two middle school buildings. But no change for the high school. So this is the same high school boundary. What did that mean for some of the projections? Here we can see a similar theme with Coron Elementary where it's slightly over. This is a near impossibility to fix. If you're familiar with the Coron Elementary, what would we take out around that core area around the building? It's a pretty tight knit area, but they're always right at capacity. But then when we looked at Munhall and Richmond, they're under 70%. One thing I want to know, why are we noting something that's below 70%? That's usually where we start to run into decisions that the district has to make with things that might be, do we have a full-time art teacher, a full-time music teacher, do we have a full-time counselor, things that are in support of students. Once we get under 70%, we start running into some of the efficiencies, the realities of how the building operates. We may also get into different class sizes that may mean they're a little bit larger in an underutilized building. What did that mean for demographics? Again, a very similar story as what was depicted in concept one, where you're seeing some of the visuals, some of the realities of Davis and Richmond. Same thing, we're moving the dual language to Richmond, so that's going to have an impact. Again, you see that orange and green shading of where it's over or lower than what that district average was. Same thing for the demographics for the secondary. And then what did it mean for the feeder? So this is where we have more breaks in the feeder. We already have breaks in the feeder. So in this case, we have Munhall and Wild Rose that are broken between Thompson and Red Lake. And then when we look at this from a comparison of the elementary schools to the high school, we have Belgraham, Munhall, and Richmond that are broken. Again, we've shown you in concept one how you can accomplish having a complete elementary attendance area that would completely feed to the high school. You think complete feeders in that way is a good thing? You may like concept one. You may be fine with a broken feeder. Okay, we're not making a judgment. We're showing you some different things based on how these concepts evolved over time. Students impacted by the boundary, very similar to what we saw in concept one. Again, you can read these charts the same way. So we're 920 elementary kids and 166 middle school kids. Remember, no high school boundary changes, there's no high school impact. So then let's talk a little bit about some of the things that occurred through the survey. So for those that actually made a choice of choosing concept one or two, concept two was the more favored. Respondents indicated in concept two some of the reasons you see bulleted point here was manageable to the impact of students, maintained neighborhoods, and did not impact high school students. So did that mean the people that voted were more in the realm of thinking of their high schoolers? I don't know that specific information. I just know how they voted for concept one or concept two. Some of the other themes that were extracted are shown below. So as we started to think about this, we know that whenever a concept is put out there, whoever's impacted, if you don't want to go to the school that you're assigned, you're going to talk. And you should talk, right? Because you have skin in the game for what it means for your kids to experience what they're experiencing in their buildings. I would expect nothing less from every parent that's seeing this change. We did note there's some transportation challenges. There were questions about what capacity meant or what that would require with class size increases. Does it increase? Or trying to impact some continuity in the journey that the students have. I always like where things get back to the kids. Not the emotional things of us as the parents, but what does it mean for the kids? Class sizes, that matters. Things about what their journey, what their experience is, whether it's their social mental well-being, those are important factors. And so we want to always make sure those are covered, but knowing that we have to make some changes to get at some of those goals the district has identified they want to see with this change. Here I'm giving you the transparency of what happened with the number of respondents. They didn't complete all of the questions, but the number of people that went to the site and responded, you can see by day how they responded to get to that 3,300 students. And again, we noted who didn't take some of those questions, like 279, they didn't respond to the demographic questions. So important to know that this gives us a little window into what people were thinking as they responded to these questions. Of the results, again, we say concept 2 at the elementary level was most supported. You see that with the blue portion of the pie chart. Again, this is based on the persons that responded, whether they like concept 1 or 2. I fully acknowledge, my team fully acknowledges, administration does, not everybody liked concept 1 or concept 2 and may have said, I'm just not voting for either, because if I vote for one, then I'm saying I like this concept. So we understand that. When we get to the middle school, again, concept 2, more support, a much greater support for concept 2 than concept 1. We look at the high school, got the boundary lines the same in concept 2. So yeah, keep them the same majority. That makes sense, right? So some concerns that were stated either at the public inputs or in the survey. And so we have the timber subdivision and what their desire was, so what their request is. We had, again, you can go down on the left-hand side, the Renal Manor, Anthem Heights. What did they want? What did Aimtree Square Lane want? What did Prairie Lake subdivision want? And so as we were trying to evolve concept 2, which is the most supported for those that made that choice, how do we make that maybe a more palatable boundary, a more palatable way of you, the experts in the community, were thinking about this from one of those different metrics, whether it was the guiding principles or the 2 different ideas of the boundary criteria prioritization. So some of those other things that were asked were to investigate a better balance between the Lincoln Elementary students in the new boundary and maintaining the Munhall Islands. We had a lot of positive feedback for some of the improvements in the middle and high school level, and they wanted us to investigate things at the high school that would be more aligned with concept 2 with the middle school. Our huge challenge there is we have a great demographic breakdown between the 2 buildings, but the 2 high schools have very different capacities. And those capacities, can we make East a more or a less efficient building at the expense of keeping a boundary or having demographics? Not our judgment. It's a conversation that maybe really starts to begin, if it already had not, as you look at some of the things that are being discussed here in 2A. If I go back to that table, you can see that we were able to make the changes for the first 3 items. And then the 4th item, we're saying we're utilizing concept 2 as the current high school boundary to try to address what that comment is. All right, so we also have some disclaimers of what we have from some of these meeting adjustments. So the new concepts are as of January 2024. They're based on the November admin meetings, the survey results, and some board direction. So they provided some feedback. They were at these public inputs. They heard from you. Excuse me. Middle school concepts, same concept as concept 2, but was presented at the public inputs. High school, again, following the direct feeder from middle school to high school. We'll show you that. Here you're going to see the elementary map. The dotted lines represents what the current boundary is. And the solid colors, what's being proposed. And the thing that I want to highlight here, and Jenna, if you can kind of mouse over some of this there on the presentation with the mouse as I talk. Some of the things that we've been able to incorporate here is if we go to the new development that's on Brugart Road, I believe. So where she's circling around on her mouse down there. That's that new development I was talking about. So that goes to Richmond. So with the information that we got about that potential development, it's being assigned to Richmond. You can see now that Richmond wraps around what was proposed as Davis in some of those concepts. If we move to the east side of the river, you're going to see a concentration for Fox Ridge Elementary from the Lincoln boundary, and it crosses over west of the river to incorporate the area that has been in Lincoln. It's now at Fox Ridge. That was a request from the public input. We then took the growth areas that you see south and around the mall, and we moved that to Munhall. And that's to get more students into Munhall. When we go to the north, you're going to see some things above the railroad track with those developments, where we move those over to Anderson. I think that's similar to one of the other concepts. When you look at Wild Rose, there's some changes around the park that puts things back into Wild Rose. That was something that we heard as far as walkability and connectivity to Wild Rose Elementary, to have that here in 2A. So that's some of the general changes that you see. The impact of that, and we talk about this with like trade-offs. So making some of these changes, you get at some of these things that pop up here to help illustrate what you're seeing. So some of these areas that I'm talking about, we had to make some changes. So area 2, which is the yellow area there, just to the west side of your district, you'll see that's the Renal Manor. On the south side, sorry, number 1. It stays in Fersen Creek. And then the other area labeled number 2, we had too many kids in Fersen Creek. Remember, if you go back to the map where I said where we have challenges, we have less facilities on the north. So in order to address capacity, we have to find ways to move students that are on the north side to the south. And so this is a way in which we're able to address that. When we look at the middle school, this is what was proposed as concept 2 at the public input meetings. So again, this gave us a nice balance with our demographics. And then we were asked, let's have that boundary continue for the high school to see if we have demographics as one of our key elements of what a boundary would look like. If it works at the middle school, should it not work at the high school? Well, it'll work demographically, but then this gets what you heard me say earlier, the capacities difference between north and east, a challenge, right? We also have areas that are directly north of north that would literally drive by north to get to east. I think this is probably why the current boundary looks different currently for the middle school and the high school. It's based on where we see the physical location of the buildings and where students are to try to get the right number of kids in those buildings. Again, trade-offs. So when we get to the projections, what you're able to see in this visual is what this looks like with some of these proposed changes. And what we've been able to address, and knowingly this is a challenge with Munhall and Fox Ridge. Anything we change between those buildings, we can make the utilization above or close to 70% in those buildings. The way in which we could get more kids there is going to require students that aren't in Munhall or Fox Ridge to go there. So it might be things like in Norton Creek, to move into that attendance area to get them above 70%. But again, you see the utilization of each of those buildings as it relates back to those building capacities. Again, Quoron, just like concept 1 and 2, still above 100%. We come down to the middle schools, again, same as what was presented for concept 2 last public input meetings. You see what that looks like. And then now when we get to East and North High School, you can see that keeping that boundary the same makes North basically 100%, while East would be 70 to 75%. So a larger building, less efficiently used with those current boundaries, meaning more work would need to be done beyond just saying those middle school boundaries would transition to the high school. So again, draft. What did this mean for demographics? You can see that breakdown of the demographics with the ethnicity and with the socioeconomics. One of the things that is good about the changes that we made between Davis and Richmond and with the new development's not in the enrollment forecast, but we've allotted for there to be space in Richmond for those students to go there. What it does do is it gets that free and reduced lunch percentage to a much more, I'm going to use the word manageable, because there were some percentages where we were over 70%. That didn't seem like that was an equitable situation. And having a new development that feeds into Richmond should make this situation even better over time with what they've indicated the sale or lease values might be for those developments. So again, we've tried to address some of these things naturally that could occur with some of the developments. You can look at that secondary demographic analysis. Just like I told you, if we look at that free and reduced lunch, pretty darn good balance between them. But when we get back to the number of students in the buildings, is that really what we want? One building that basically is utilizing everything and another building that has quite a bit of space. As we look at what that feeder analysis is, Fox Ridge and Wild Rose are broken as we look at that moving into the middle schools. And you can see that percentage breakdown of what that means. And then now we have a small area of Fox Ridge that also has a break between Thompson and Redland. Again, not a perfect plan. We look at the students impacted by the boundary change, less than what we've seen in some of the other concepts, 766 at the elementary level. That's really nice. And a lot of that comes into the Lincoln area being concentrated more with what their change is. We're not splitting it 3 ways as what was seen based on whether you were west of the river or you were in Munhall or Fox Ridge. So lots of different changes happening with the SIBC. A little bit less than what we saw in concept 1 or 2. All right, a little bit with the concept comparison. Projected enrollment building utilization, demographic considerations, feeder system, students that are impacted by the boundary change, duration of boundaries, fiscal consideration capital, and neighborhoods intact. You'll see that on the left-hand side. You'll see what the current situation is. And then Jenna did an excellent job of trying to categorize this not only by the concept, but a color. So you can see going down those columns, concept 1, what was presented at the November meetings. You can see what that meant for each of these metrics. Same thing for concept 2, and then some of the adjustments that occur there in the far right-hand column of concept 2A. So there's some things you may be a parent and you say, this made it worse because you're now a family that's impacted that was not impacted by what was presented at concept 1 and 2. Again, thank administration and the board that we had this webinar so that you could hear what some of these thoughts were from the public inputs, some of the thoughts that came from what the board was discussing with the leadership team, and trying to present some information so that you can see from different perspectives of how these changes could look. I think our expectation as we move forward, and I know Dr. Gordon will touch a little bit on this as we get into the survey, because I'm about done with what I'm going to say tonight. All of this will move to the board. And they're going to look for your comments from this webinar. So this is my information to officially hand off to Dr. Gordon things of the next steps, what the expectations are from you, the community.
Robert, great job. I just appreciate you and Jenny's professionalism, all the work that you've done, and having a partner like RSP go through this process with the D303 community. It's meant a lot to get us to this point. And as you said, we're going to be sharing out our survey. This is an opportunity now for our community to re-engage in the process, to give their feedback on concept 1, concept 2, concept 2A. But I really want to make sure this is clear. I've said it, Robert said it. I just want to put it up in writing now. Each concept presented is a standalone concept. When completing the survey, participants can select a different concept number for each grade level and share what they like about that concept and their concerns. Example, I'm taking the survey. I'm going to select concept 2A at the elementary, concept 1 for middle school, and concept 2 for high school. They do not need to be aligned. So I just wanted to make that really clear. So on February 12th, just to continue this conversation, the board will vote separately on the concepts for elementary, middle, and high school. So the survey link is live now, and it's going to close on Monday, January 15th at 12 p.m. This is a much quicker time turnaround than we've had in the past. So we need your feedback. We need to hear about that. On Tuesday, January 12th, the board will again re-engage in this conversation. Rob will be with us in person as the board navigates through these different concepts, as they look through each one and takes in all this information, and continues to move forward for that February 12th decision day. Prior to that, they have January 29th. They'll again, on that night, that's the night I'm hopeful that the board moves forward a recommendation for whichever concepts. So we are nearing the end of this. Again, why the survey's so important for everybody to participate in and give their thoughts to us. I want to conclude by giving you we recognize there's some weather events happening out there. We're going to be making some communication here very shortly. We're trying to get through the webinar before we make our communication out to our community. But I'll let you in on a little secret that we are going to have. We are closing our schools tomorrow. Scott Harvey, our communication chief, will be communicating out to all of our families here in the next 10 to 15 minutes where we're at. But thank you all so much for participating, for sticking with us, for really engaging in this process. And I want to thank the D303 Board of Education for really driving this process and getting us to this point. I hope everybody has a great night. Be safe over these next 48 hours. We have a lot of weather coming our way. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.